A black woman was climbing into a wagon to leave forever. Then the cowboy handed her a document that made her freeze. The wagon horses shifted impatiently in the morning cold. Charlie was crying on the porch. Ben stood silent with his fists buried deep in his coat pockets. Hannah tightened her grip on the suitcase she had carried through a winter storm months before. Then Wade stepped forward and placed a folded packet of papers in her hands. The wind rattled the ranch gate as she opened the first page, and suddenly nobody moved. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. Winter came early to Blackstone Valley in 1887. The wind had been rising for 3 days, sweeping down from the Absaroka Mountains and dragging snow across the open country. By afternoon, the roads around Red Creek were nearly hidden beneath drifting white. Hannah Brooks stood alone in the freight office where she had worked for 4 years. The room smelled of lamp oil, damp wool, and old paper. A ledger lay open on the desk. So did the accusation. Owen Price stood near the stove with 2 town deputies beside him. His hands rested calmly behind his back. "The money is gone," he said. Hannah looked at him without blinking. "And you're saying I took it?" The deputies shifted uneasily. Everyone in the room knew Hannah kept the cleanest records in town. Everyone knew she could find a missing receipt from 6 months ago in less than a minute. But Owen already had his story prepared. "The books were under your care." Hannah glanced toward the ledger. Something felt wrong. Not missing. Changed. Pages had been replaced. Numbers altered. But nobody wanted explanations that afternoon. By sunset, she was dismissed. By dark, the story had already spread through Red Creek. Doors closed when she approached. A boarding house owner suddenly had no vacancy. The diner waitress avoided her eyes. A stable owner who had greeted her every morning for years quietly shook his head. The snow kept falling. By 9 o'clock, the town had disappeared behind a curtain of white. Hannah carried a single suitcase and walked toward the old freight depot outside town. The building had been abandoned since the new rail spur opened. Its windows rattled in the wind. Its waiting room was cold enough to see her breath. She sat on a wooden bench and wrapped her coat tighter. Outside, darkness swallowed the valley. Hours passed. Then came laughter. Male voices, drunken voices, boots crunching through snow. Hannah slowly stood. The depot door opened. 3 men stumbled inside carrying the smell of whiskey and wet leather. One of them recognized her. "Well," he said, "looks like Red Creek's famous bookkeeper." The others laughed. Hannah backed away. The wind screamed through a crack in the wall. Then another sound appeared. Horse hooves. Slow. Steady. The men heard it too. A shadow crossed the frosted window. The depot door opened again. Snow blew into the room. A tall man stepped inside wearing a heavy ranch coat dusted white from the storm. Wade Sullivan. The men immediately fell silent. Wade looked at them, then at Hannah. Nothing in his face changed. "Storm's getting worse," he said. No one answered. He removed his gloves 1 finger at a time. The room somehow felt smaller. The men exchanged glances. One muttered something and headed for the door. The others followed. Within seconds, they were gone. Only the wind remained. Hannah let out a slow breath. Wade looked toward the windows where snow was piling against the building. "Road will be closed by morning." She nodded. "I know." "You got somewhere to go?" "No." The answer hung between them. Wade studied the storm outside. Then he said quietly, "Come with me." Hannah almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because she was too tired for anything else. She looked at this stranger standing in the drifting snow, a cowboy with tired eyes and a weathered coat, a man she barely knew. "I never asked for love." The words escaped before she could stop them. Wade pulled his gloves back on. "Good." He opened the door. "Neither did I." The wind rushed inside again. I'm offering shelter." For a long moment, Hannah stood motionless. Then she picked up her suitcase. Outside, Wade's horse stamped against the frozen ground. They started toward the darkness beyond Red Creek. As Hannah climbed into the wagon beside him, she glanced back toward town. Across the street, beneath the awning of the Red Creek Bank, a figure stood watching. Even through the falling snow, she recognized him. Owen Price. He wasn't smiling anymore, and for the first time since she had been accused, Hannah realized something. Owen wasn't relieved that she was leaving. He was afraid she was staying. That thought followed Hannah Brooks long after the lights of Red Creek disappeared behind the storm. The wagon moved slowly through the darkness. Snow swept across the road in silver sheets. The lantern hanging from the wagon swayed with every rut and frozen patch beneath the wheels. Wade Sullivan said very little. He drove with both gloved hands wrapped around the reins, eyes fixed on the white road ahead. Once, near midnight, he handed Hannah a metal coffee cup. Steam curled into the cold air. "Still warm," he said. It was the first thing he'd said in nearly an hour. She wrapped her fingers around the cup. The coffee tasted strong and bitter. It felt like life returning. By dawn, the storm had begun to weaken. The mountains appeared first, dark shapes against a pale winter sky. Then came fences, fields, a windmill turning slowly above a frozen stock pond, and finally a ranch house sitting alone on a rise overlooking the valley. Cedar Ridge Ranch. It wasn't impressive. The porch leaned slightly to one side. One shutter hung crooked. The barn roof carried patches of old repair work, but smoke rose from the chimney. And somehow, that mattered. The wagon rolled through the front gate. A boy stood near the barn, carrying a feed bucket. 14, maybe. Tall for his age. Sharp eyes. He spotted Hannah immediately. The bucket stopped halfway to the ground. "Wade?" His voice carried across the yard. Wade climbed down from the wagon. "Morning, Ben." The boy glanced between them. "Who's she?" Hannah saw his shoulders tighten, saw the question behind the question. Why was a stranger here? Why now? Wade took Hannah's suitcase from the wagon. "Her name's Hannah Brooks." Ben waited. Nothing else came. The silence stretched. Finally, the boy muttered something under his breath and carried the bucket toward the barn. A smaller figure appeared at the doorway. Charlie, 8 years old, barely taller than the porch railing. His curiosity was stronger than his caution. He stared openly. Hannah almost smiled. Almost. Charlie lifted a hand. She nodded back. The boy grinned immediately. Wade noticed but said nothing. Inside, the house smelled of pine wood, coffee, and yesterday's biscuits. A cast-iron stove warmed the kitchen. Boots sat neatly beside the door. A patched coat hung from a peg. The place looked lived in, not polished, not perfect, just honest. Wade carried her suitcase down a short hallway. He stopped beside a small room. The door opened with a soft creak. A narrow bed stood beneath the window. A sewing table occupied one corner. Sunlight touched a faded quilt folded across the mattress. "My wife used this room." His voice remained calm. Not sad, not distant, simply true. Hannah nodded. Wade placed a small brass key in her hand. The metal felt cold against her skin. "Your room." He paused. "Your decision." For a moment, Hannah simply stared at the key. No one had handed her a key in years, not a real one, not one that belonged to her. After Wade left, she closed the door and turned the lock. The click echoed softly through the room. She stood there longer than necessary, just listening. 3 days later, she was helping in the ranch office. Not because anyone asked, because she couldn't ignore what she saw. Ledgers stacked unevenly, receipts shoved into drawers, feed invoices mixed with cattle records. The books were a mess. Wade sat across from her at a rough pine desk. "You don't have to do that." Hannah continued sorting papers. "I know." He watched her a moment, then returned to sharpening a pencil with his pocket knife. Outside, the sound of hammering drifted from the barn. Ben repairing a loose gate, Charlie chasing chickens, life moving forward. The ranch books told another story, one Hannah understood immediately. Debt. Too much of it. Interest payments appeared every month. Higher. Then higher again. She pulled one document closer, then another. The numbers didn't match. By lantern light that evening, she checked them again. Still wrong. 3 days later, she checked a third time. Definitely wrong. Someone was increasing the rates. Not by much, just enough to hide it. Just enough to bleed a ranch dry over time. Hannah copied figures onto scrap paper, compared dates, compared signatures. Her eyes narrowed. The same name appeared again and again. Jasper Crow, owner of the Red Creek Bank. She expected that. What she didn't expect was the second signature. The moment she saw it, her stomach tightened. Owen Price. His approval mark sat beneath one of the loan documents. Another appeared 6 months later. And another. Why would a freight company manager be involved in ranch financing? The question settled heavily in the room. Outside, wind rattled the windows. Charlie laughed somewhere down the hall. A floorboard creaked. Life continued normally. Yet Hannah stared at the paper in her hands. Because for the second time in a week, she had found Owen Price where he wasn't supposed to be. And suddenly, the accusations in Red Creek felt less like a mistake, and far more like a plan. The lantern flame flickered. Hannah carefully folded the document and slipped it into her notebook. Across the room, Wade looked up from his ledger. Neither spoke. But somehow he seemed to know she had just found something important. Something dangerous. Something that connected Red Creek to Cedar Ridge Ranch in a way neither of them yet understood. Outside, snow began falling again across Blackstone Valley. Quiet, patient, covering tracks, hiding secrets, for now. Winter settled deeper across Blackstone Valley. The snowbanks along the fence lines grew taller each week. Mornings began before sunrise. Coffee simmered on the stove. Boots waited by the door. The days found their rhythm. Hannah became part of that rhythm without anyone ever announcing it. She helped Wade organize receipts after supper. She balanced feed costs against cattle sales. She found 3 duplicate charges hidden among the bank statements and quietly saved the ranch nearly $20 before Christmas. Wade noticed. He simply nodded and handed her another stack of papers. For him, trust seemed to arrive through work. One cold morning, Hannah found a tin cup waiting beside the stove. Fresh coffee, a little cream already mixed in. No note, no explanation. Charlie wandered into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Uncle Wade leaves yours there every day now." The boy said it casually before reaching for a biscuit. Hannah looked toward the window. Outside, Wade was already crossing the yard toward the barn. She said nothing, but she drank the coffee while it was still warm. A few weeks later, Charlie carried a primer book into the kitchen. "I keep getting stuck on this word." Hannah pulled out a chair. "Let's see." The lesson lasted 10 minutes, then 20, then nearly an hour. By February, Charlie was reading entire paragraphs aloud. Whenever he stumbled, Hannah waited. She never rushed him, never finished the words for him. One evening, Wade paused in the doorway while Charlie proudly read from the book beside the lamp. The boy missed 3 words, corrected himself, then finished the page. Wade's eyes moved toward Hannah. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Across the ranch, another change was happening. Ben Sullivan still kept his distance, still watched her carefully. But the hostility had begun to crack. The moment came during a bitter cold snap. Ben's favorite horse, a bay gelding named Ranger, had gotten trapped outside during a sudden freeze. The animal returned limping and shivering. Ben spent hours trying to warm him. Nothing worked. Hannah found the boy sitting alone in the barn long after dark. The lantern beside him burned low. "He won't eat," Ben said quietly. Hannah knelt beside the horse. She checked its legs, its breathing, its ears. Then she stood. "Help me." Ben looked surprised, but he followed. Together they carried blankets from the house, warmed water on the stove, worked until nearly midnight. By dawn, the horse was standing again. Weak, but standing. Ben never thanked her, not directly. A week later, she found her split firewood already stacked beside her porch steps. No one claimed responsibility. She knew exactly who had done it. February brought another discovery. While reviewing old loan papers, Hannah found evidence that several ranchers in the valley were paying suspiciously similar interest rates. Too high. Far too high. Different loans. Different years. The same pattern. The same signatures. Jasper Crow, again, and Owen Price, again. The connection was no longer coincidence. Someone had been manipulating accounts for years. One snowy afternoon, Hannah rode into Red Creek with Wade. The wagon wheels rolled through slush and packed snow. People watched when she stepped onto the boardwalk. Not openly, but enough. Conversations quieted. A woman outside the mercantile whispered something to her friend. Two men near the barber shop stopped talking as she passed. By evening, the rumor finally reached Cedar Ridge. Charlie heard it first, then Ben. The woman staying at Sullivan Ranch is after Wade's property. The word spread through town faster than winter wind. That night, Hannah sat alone at the kitchen table staring at a ledger she wasn't reading. Wade entered carrying a lantern. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he set the lantern down. "I don't care what they're saying." She looked up. The light softened the lines around his eyes. "Maybe you should." "I don't." Another silence, the kind that felt strangely comfortable. Then Wade reached for his coat. "I've got fences to check." At the door, he paused. "They talk because they don't know you." The door closed behind him. Hannah sat motionless for a long time afterward. Outside, snow drifted across the yard. Inside, the kitchen suddenly felt warmer. The trouble arrived 3 nights later. A sharp smell woke Hannah before dawn. Smoke. She sat upright, then heard shouting. The house erupted with movement. Wade was already running toward the barn. Ben right behind him. Orange light flickered against the windows. Hannah pulled on her coat and rushed outside. The hay storage shed stood against the darkness like a giant torch. Flames climbed into the winter sky. Men formed a bucket line from the stock tank. Snow hissed where it touched the burning boards. The fire was eventually contained, but not before most of the winter hay was lost. The next morning, the ranch looked different, smaller somehow, more vulnerable. A week later, the sheriff arrived with news. One of the hired hands from another property had confessed. Someone had paid him. Not much, just enough. The name reached Cedar Ridge before sunset. Owen Price. Wade stood on the porch listening. His jaw tightened. Ben kicked at the frozen dirt. Charlie stared toward the mountains. Hannah felt the cold settle deeper than before. Because the fire changed everything. It meant Owen Price wasn't merely protecting a lie anymore. He was trying to remove obstacles, and Hannah Brooks had become one of them. For the first time since arriving at Cedar Ridge Ranch, she realized that whatever secret connected Owen Price and Jasper Crow was bigger than stolen money. Much bigger. And now they knew she was looking. The weeks that followed felt different. Not louder. Quieter. The kind of quiet that made people check over their shoulders before speaking. Spring had begun to loosen winter's grip on Blackstone Valley. Snow still lingered in the shadows of the hills, but muddy wagon tracks had returned to the roads around Red Creek. Hannah kept working. She sorted records after supper, copied figures into notebooks, compared signatures, dates, amounts, small details most people ignored. The truth was hiding inside ordinary paperwork. One evening, Reverend Cole arrived at Cedar Ridge Ranch carrying a leather satchel. Charlie was reading beside the stove. Ben was repairing a harness strap. Wade opened the door and stepped aside. The old minister removed his hat. "I found something." Hannah looked up immediately. Reverend Cole placed several folded documents on the kitchen table. They came from the church donation records. The room fell silent. One paper matched a payment listed in Jasper Crow's books. Another did not. The amounts were different. The signatures were different. But the dates were exactly the same. Hannah's pulse quickened. Someone had been creating false records for years, not just against Wade, against dozens of ranchers throughout the valley. Ben slowly lowered the harness strap. "You mean they've been stealing from everybody?" Nobody answered, because the papers already had. A week later, notices appeared throughout Red Creek. A public meeting, town hall, attendance requested. Jasper Crow would be addressing several matters concerning local debts. Everyone knew what it meant. By the following Saturday, the hall was packed. Ranchers, store owners, farm families, bank customers, every chair filled. People stood along the walls. Hannah entered with Wade, Ben, Charlie, and Reverend Cole. Conversations stopped, then quietly resumed. Jasper Crow stood at the front of the room wearing a black suit and silver watch chain. His smile never reached his eyes. Beside him stood Owen Price, clean-shaven, confident, as though he had nothing to fear. Jasper opened the meeting himself. Cedar Ridge Ranch currently owes substantial debt to the Red Creek Bank. Several heads turned toward Wade. Jasper continued, "Unless arrangements are made, foreclosure proceedings may begin." A murmur spread through the crowd. Then Owen stepped forward. "And before anyone forgets, the woman advising Mr. Sullivan is the same woman dismissed from the freight company for missing funds." The room tightened. Hannah felt every eye turn toward her. She remained standing, still, quiet. A few people looked away. Others didn't. Ben shifted beside her. For the first time since she'd arrived at Cedar Ridge, she saw fear in his face. Not fear for himself. Fear for the ranch. Fear of losing the only home he'd ever known. Jasper folded his hands. "I believe the people of this valley deserve to know who they're trusting." The silence lasted only a second. Then Hannah stepped forward. She carried a worn leather folder. Nothing more. No speech. No anger. No raised voice. She simply laid the documents across the front table, one by one. Original ledgers, freight receipts, bank statements, copies she'd made during months of careful work. The room slowly grew quiet. Even Jasper stopped smiling. Hannah opened the first ledger. The missing freight funds were transferred here. She pointed to a date, then another, then another. Owen's face began to pale. Reverend Cole stepped beside her. "I verified these entries myself." Another rancher stood up from the audience. "Old Samuel Briggs, a man respected across 3 counties. I found the same irregular charges in my accounts." More voices followed, then another, and another. The pattern became impossible to ignore. The evidence fit together too cleanly, too completely. By the time Hannah finished speaking, nobody was looking at her anymore. They were looking at Owen, at Jasper, at years of lies spread across tables for everyone to see. Owen finally stood. "I don't know where she got those papers," but the confidence was gone. The room knew it. So did he. Jasper attempted to speak next. No one listened. Questions came from every direction. Voices rose. Accusations followed. The meeting ended without ceremony, without victory speeches, without applause. Just the sound of a town discovering it had been deceived. Outside, evening sunlight stretched across the muddy street. People approached Hannah one at a time, not with grand apologies, just small things. A nod, a handshake, a quiet thank you. The kind of gestures that mattered more. Wade remained beside her the entire time, never touching her, never speaking for her. Simply there. By the time they returned to Cedar Ridge Ranch, darkness had fallen. Charlie fell asleep in the wagon before they reached the gate. Ben sat unusually quiet. The ranch looked peaceful beneath the stars. For the first time in months, Hannah should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt restless, because the danger was over. The accusations were gone. The truth was finally known, and that left her with a problem she could no longer ignore. Later that night, she sat alone on the edge of her bed. Her suitcase rested beside the wall, the same suitcase she'd carried from Red Creek during the storm. Slowly, she opened it, then began folding her clothes, carefully, methodically. One dress, one notebook, one pair of gloves. Down the hall, she could hear Charlie laughing at something Ben had said. She paused, then continued packing. Not because anyone wanted her gone, not because she was afraid, but because somewhere between winter and spring, between coffee cups and ledgers and quiet evenings by the stove, she had begun to love a man who had never asked for anything from her, and that frightened her more than the storm ever had. The sun rose slowly over Blackstone Valley. A pale band of gold appeared above the Absaroka Mountains, touching the frost that still clung to the fence posts and wagon tracks. Hannah had been awake for hours. Her suitcase sat beside the front door, folded neatly, ready. The same suitcase that had arrived during a snowstorm months earlier. Nothing looked different, yet everything did. She buttoned her coat and stepped onto the porch. The air carried the smell of damp earth and fresh-cut lumber. Somewhere beyond the barn, a hammer struck wood. 3 steady blows, then silence. Life continuing as always. Inside the house, Charlie was crying, trying not to, failing. I don't want her to go, his voice drifted through the screen door. Ben answered more quietly. Neither boy knew Hannah could hear them. You can't make people stay. Charlie sniffed. She belongs here. The words settled heavily in the morning air. Hannah looked toward the mountains. For a moment she closed her eyes. Then she picked up her suitcase. When she reached the wagon, Wade Sullivan was already there. A team of horses stood harnessed. The morning light touched the brim of his hat. He looked exactly as he had the night they met. Calm, steady, difficult to read. Charlie ran across the yard and wrapped his arms around Hannah's waist. She set the suitcase down, held him close. His shoulders shook once, then again. Ben approached more slowly. The boy who had once wanted her gone now stood awkwardly beside the wagon, hands shoved into his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the ground. Finally he spoke. You know, he cleared his throat, then tried again. Your family. The words came out rough, like they had fought their way through him. Hannah felt something tighten in her chest. She reached out and squeezed his shoulder. Ben nodded once, looking embarrassed by his own honesty, then stepped back. The valley was quiet. Only the wind moved. Wade picked up a flat bundle wrapped in brown paper. I need you to look at something. Hannah accepted it. The paper crackled softly as she untied the string. Inside were legal documents, several pages, official seals, county records. At first, she didn't understand what she was seeing. Then she saw her name, Hannah Brooks, beside another name, Wade Sullivan. She looked up sharply. Wade remained where he stood, hands resting loosely at his sides. The attorney filed it last week. She turned another page. The documents granted her ownership in part of Cedar Ridge Ranch. Not a gift, Not charity. A legal share. Earned, documented, permanent. For several seconds, she couldn't speak. "You don't owe me anything," Wade said. His voice remained quiet. "You never did." The wind stirred the edges of the papers. Hannah swallowed. "Why?" Wade looked toward the distant mountains, the same mountains he watched every morning, the same mountains that had witnessed his grief long before she arrived. When he finally answered, he didn't look at her. "Because I never wanted someone to stay, because they had nowhere else to go." His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, only because they wanted to. Nobody spoke after that. Not immediately. Charlie wiped his eyes. Ben stared at the ground. A meadowlark landed on a fence rail. The world seemed to pause. Hannah looked down at the papers again, then beyond them, beyond the ranch, beyond the valley. Back to the freight depot. Back to the storm. Back to a night when she had been cold, alone, and certain nobody would ever choose her without wanting something in return. She remembered standing beside Wade's wagon, remembered the snow, remembered her own words. "I never asked for love." A faint smile touched Wade's face. "I know." The answer was barely above a whisper, but it carried farther than anything else he had ever said. Hannah looked at the wagon, then at the house, the porch, the barn, the fields, Charlie, Ben, the man standing before her. Slowly she folded the papers, set them on the wagon seat, and stepped away from the wagon, toward him. Not because she needed saving, not because she had nowhere else to go, not because anyone asked. She simply reached for his hand. And this time she was the one making the choice. 1 year later, spring returned to Blackstone Valley. The grass grew thick across the hills. The creek ran high from melting snow. Cedar Ridge Ranch looked different. New fence lines stretched across the pasture. The barn roof had been repaired. Fresh paint brightened the porch. Business was good, better than it had been in years. Ben spent his days studying mechanical drawings and rail surveys, preparing for work with the expanding railroad. Charlie read every evening beside the stove, sometimes aloud, sometimes to Hannah. Jasper Crow and Owen Price had long since left Wyoming. Their names survived only in old conversations and courthouse records. On a warm Sunday afternoon, church bells echoed across Red Creek. Families gathered outside the wooden church. Children chased one another beneath the cottonwoods. As Hannah and Wade stepped from their wagon, people greeted them with smiles instead of whispers. A few tipped their hats. Others stopped to shake hands. An older woman waved from across the road. "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan." Hannah heard the name and smiled. Not because of the title, because it no longer felt borrowed. It felt true. That evening, the sky turned orange above the valley. The mountains glowed beneath the last light of day. Hannah and Wade stood together on the porch. No words were necessary. The ranch spread before them. Home. Real home. Wade slipped an arm around her shoulders. She leaned gently against him. The past still existed. The accusations, the storm, the loneliness. All of it remained part of the road behind them, but it no longer followed them. The wind moved softly through the fields. Somewhere in the distance, Charlie laughed. A horse nickered from the barn. And beneath the Wyoming sunset, two people who had never gone looking for love stood side by side and discovered that sometimes the best things arrive quietly, like shelter during a storm, like trust, like home, like love. As the last light faded beyond the Wyoming mountains, it wasn't the ranch, the repaired fences, or even the years of hard work that stayed with me most. It was a simple choice, a choice made by two people who had both carried loneliness for far too long. And maybe that's why this story lingers. Because if you place yourself where Hannah once stood, Cold, unwanted, carrying everything you own in a single suitcase, you realize how easy it would have been to stop trusting people altogether. And if you imagine standing where Wade stood, after years of loss and silence, you understand how much courage it takes to open a door again when life has taught you to keep it closed. What makes this story beautiful isn't that someone came to rescue someone else. It's that neither of them asked to be saved. They simply offered each other dignity, a place at the table, a reason to stay. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive with grand speeches. Sometimes it arrives as a warm cup of coffee left on a stove before sunrise. Sometimes it looks like a key placed in your hand. Sometimes it sounds like someone saying, "You don't owe me anything." If this story touched you, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, what do you think matters more? Being loved or being truly chosen? And if stories like this remind you that good people still exist, I hope you'll join us again. There are many more journeys waiting ahead. Stories of second chances, quiet courage, unexpected love, and the kind of hope that often appears when life seems determined to take it away. Until next time, take care of yourself and keep a light burning in the window for the people who may still be trying to find their way home.